This video is about those things that we can actually know about God. I mean, like know, like you know the sky is blue. Now, of course, most of the stuff people believe about God is either speculation or um, faith in the testimony of another person. But there are some things we can know, and of course, some of it depends on what you think of God. I'll start with a variation of the first mover argument, and then move on to psychological considerations of God. And so anyway, my take on the first mover argument, I'm not the first person to do this, but anyway, this is my argument that logic, as we typically understand it, is rules of correct inference from assumed premises. So you need assumed premises, otherwise you can't do logic at all. You need to assume something and then you can do logic. If you want to explain something that was previously an assumption, like explain a cause, then you need to assume something else in order to explain it. And that kind of gets you to a turtle all the way down. When you're looking for ultimate explanations of anything, you kind of get a turtle all the way down situation, or infinite regression of causes. So it seems clear that if you need to assume something in order to do some kind of logical operation, then looking for ultimate causes is outside the bounds of ordinary logic. You get something like an unmoved mover, or an uncaused cause, necessary premise, whatever you want to call it, something that causes stuff without being caused, or you get an infinite regression of causes with no beginning, or you get circular reasoning where something causes itself, or a series of things cause themselves to happen. And ordinarily you wouldn't consider it valid to say that an assumption is necessarily true, or that there's an infinite regression of causes. And circular reasoning is also, of course, not usually considered valid. But considering that the universe exists, and we believe there's some kind of, if you believe there's some kind of ultimate cause to it, then there exists something. The existence of existence itself is proof that there is at least something that exists that is outside the bounds of ordinary logic. Now, if you believe that the universe had a beginning and did have an ultimate cause, and it's not infinite regression or circular logic, then you very quickly get to a monotheistic idea that is shared by Christianity and all the monotheistic religions. And that is the uncaused cause, or I like to think of it sometimes as a necessary premise. And if this thing causes other things and itself is not caused, then that gives you the idea of free will. Because what is free will if it's not that it can choose without being forced? So yes, if there is a beginning to the universe, the idea of free will becomes very natural for that being, in which case it's natural to think of it as a person. It's natural to think of it as a creator. And yeah, that basically points you in the direction of how people have imagined God for a long time. Now, of course, there's no way of proving that that's the way it really is. It's just consistent with how we can imagine things to be. Maybe it could be, I've heard an argument that about cosmological evolution, that maybe whenever there's a black hole and a singularity, a new universe spawns inside that singularity, which would be consistent with how our universe could have gotten started from a big bang, from a singularity. And if the laws of physics change a little bit whenever that happens, then you would expect universes that are good at creating singularities to become more numerous. And that's why it would be called cosmological evolution. Of course, that still doesn't explain how the process got started, but with that idea, there could be an idea of infinite regression. Or maybe if you pass through a few black holes, you end up somehow back to where you started, in which case maybe the universe is circular. But anyway, if the universe does have a beginning or an ultimate cause, and the ultimate cause doesn't necessarily have to be temporal in nature, then that does point pretty solidly to an idea of God that kind of proves theism. Yeah, basically, if the universe does have an ultimate cause, then the only way we can imagine it is deism. That doesn't prove that that's the case, but pretty much if you believe in ultimate beginning, then you believe in deism, is basically, or that it's just completely outside the bounds of what we can even talk about or imagine. So that, I think, is a fairly solid argument. And then there is our experience of God, and we know about that because we experience it. And it seems to me that our experience of God is something of a personification and projection of our own internal ideals. And we know that exists, like I said, because we experience it. And even if God didn't exist outside of that, outside of our belief in Him, then it would still be worth paying attention to that, because our ideals order everything else that happens in our lives. So whether you believe that your ideals are God or something less personal, then it's still worth paying attention to your highest ideals, whether you want to call it God or not. And there's something I forgot to mention also. I heard the idea once, which I didn't really like, that God could be unconscious. Maybe He creates the universe without knowing what He's doing. And I didn't like the idea at first, but then I realized, well, I guess if God is unconscious, how can you tell the difference between an unconscious God and just the laws of nature? So in that sense, you kind of know that God exists because we experience that nature is ordered. So I guess you could argue about whether God is conscious, like whether God knows He exists and does things on purpose or not. But if you are willing to think of God as possibly being unconscious, then there's pretty much no question that He exists, because that's indistinguishable from the laws of nature. But anyway, I'll go back to talking about God as a person, as a projection of our own ideals. So that's important because your ideals order your whole life. So thinking about that is good. And you can think of objective morality. Lots of people argue about what objective morality consists of, but I think everybody could agree that if an objective reality exists, then objective morality consists in conforming the subjective world to the objective. And then, in other words, just trying to find out what's true and operating according to truth. And I think pretty much everybody can agree on that. And then the only argument would be what objective reality consists of. And with that view, it would seem natural that you would want your highest ideals, or whatever you imagine God to be, to conform as best you can to how you understand the world actually is. So that seems like something useful you can, and not totally vague or arbitrary statement you can make. And I like to think of human experience as being divided between the sensory, intellectual, and moral. I think pretty much, I'm not aware of anything we can experience that can't be subdivided into those three categories. And moral questions are by their nature not objective. Like, there's no test you can perform to prove that something is good or bad. Like, how could you prove that murder is bad? If you try to do it with science, you take a control group of 10 people and not kill them, and then take another group of 10 people and kill them. But how would that prove anything? You can't get a meter stick and prove that it's good or bad. So you can't prove that murdering is bad unless you already have some kind of moral assumption you're working with. And yet, if we don't have ideas about good and bad, then we aren't able to function. So it seems to me that it is actually mandatory for proper functioning in the world to speculate about good and bad, even though it will be impossible in the end to prove that everything you think of is true. Which is a funny situation. You're obligated to speculate on something that you can never fully know the truth of. But it seems to me to be true that if you want to function in the world, you just do have to speculate about morality, which is, as people have understood God in the past, it is the same thing as speculating about God. So it seems reasonable to me that it is objectively required morally to conform your understanding of morality to those objective parts of reality that you actually understand. And it is permissible probably to speculate about moral questions that to speculate about things that you don't really know the truth of, like the beginning of the universe. So like, I would imagine that, for example, of the first point, that you should conform your idea your ideas about the world to what you really know. I think it's wrong to, in the modern world, to hold on to an idea of a 6,000-year-old Earth and a flat Earth because you have literal interpretation of the Bible. Because then you'd have to reject logic and experimentation. That you'd have to reject a lot of logic and experience that people have had in order to hold on to those things. And I think the reason people do that is to protect their idea of God. I think that conception of God is unhealthy because it gives them a distorted view of the world. But I think for an issue where we don't know the answer, like the beginning of the universe, if you speculate about that in a manner that gives meaning to your life, but doesn't distort your view about what you really know about the world, then that's probably okay. Because it doesn't hurt what you know sensorially, it doesn't give you a contradictory picture of the world, and yet it does give you meaning. So I think it's probably okay to do that, to speculate about the nature of God to speculate about the nature of God when you really don't know the answer, if it gives you meaning in your life. I think that's an okay thing. And maybe it's even a mandatory thing if you gotta try to figure out how to live in the world. Oh, and there's another thing about God that I think is very useful, especially in the Christian tradition. It seems to me that people want to feel good, and we are able to lie to ourselves in order to make ourselves feel good. And the lie we tell to ourselves is often about ourselves, to make ourselves feel good. We lie about ourselves to ourselves to make ourselves feel good. And we do that to make ourselves happy. That seems to be in our nature. It's a very common problem, and I believe most, if not all, of the evil things people do come from that in one way or another. But believing in and loving something more powerful and more glorious than yourself can be a solution to this, because it means you'll be able to experience good feelings without having to have necessarily a positive view of the self. So, in other words, believing in an ultimately good God and that everything is going to be okay in the end can make you feel happy, and that removes in large part the psychological motive for telling lies about yourself to make yourself feel good, because you have another way to feel happy. So I guess I'll summarize by saying that I think speculation about God as the meaning of life is mandatory, and that is naturally probably related to how the universe got started, or ultimate beginnings. God as an idea can be dangerous if it's just an excuse to do what you wanted to do anyway, and having ideas of God that aren't consistent with reality can give you a distorted view of reality too. So there's two dangers in believing in God. One is that it's just an excuse to do what you'd want to do anyway, and it might give you a distorted view of the world if your idea of God isn't very accurate. That God can also be very good for you if it serves as an ideal which organizes your life, and it can protect you from the psychological incentive to lie about yourself.